Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Richard Fountain, professor of piano at Wayland Baptist University in Plainview, Texas, and a longtime friend of mine. He was actually my grad school office mate, and I'm so delighted to have him on the program today to talk about Rachmaninoff. Thanks for joining me today, Richard.
You're so welcome. This is a great pleasure.
So, the composer we're discussing today, Sergei Rachmaninoff, presents us with an interesting sort of spiritual biography, especially as we see in his life how a Christian atmosphere can saturate the imagination at an early age and inspire rich artistic works. In Rachmaninoff's published recollections, he relates how the sounds of Orthodox Christianity, especially the tones used in the liturgy and the sound of the bell, enchanted him as a child. And of course, they become key elements of his compositions. We've got an entire episode on the sound and role of bells planned for the future, since it's such a rich topic. But I'm wondering if you, as an Eastern Orthodox convert from evangelical Protestantism, could give us some insights on how this sound, which he considered more lovely than all else, plays a role in his compositions. And what is it about the Orthodox use of bells that's so enthralling and meaningful? How does the sound come out in Rachmaninoff's compositions, and what do you think it means for him spiritually?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the sound of bells, especially as the Russian Orthodox Church uses them, is absolutely everywhere in Rachmaninoff's music in all genres. It's not just in the music that he wrote for the Orthodox Church, but it's in his orchestral music, it's in piano music. And it's very unique among Russian composers and in the way that he uses this material, as well as the material of the chant melodies that he works with. And I think to understand how this came to be, we can set up a few things from the context of his upbringing. Rachmaninoff came from a pretty well-to-do family. They were kind of lower-level aristocrats in Russia. They had good resources. They had several estates, owned land at various places, and they were, very well placed in society. They could arrange good opportunities for their children. But unfortunately for Rachmaninoff at that particular time, his father didn't manage things very well and kind of ended up in a really bad place financially. They ended up having to move from one of their estates into St. Petersburg because they had lost, the financial ability to keep it going. He lost two of his sisters of illness just as he was starting his studies at the conservatory there in St. Petersburg, and eventually his father left the family. And Rachmaninoff's maternal grandmother stepped in to raise the children. And how this is most relevant for our discussion is she is the one who insisted that he and the other siblings go to church. She would take them to church and make them have that experience. His family, other than that, was not particularly devout, I think you would say. I think this was fairly common at the time amongst the Russian intelligentsia. I mean, it wasn't really the cool thing to do to go to church and be active in your faith. But what he was fascinated about as a child, hearing these sounds in the church, was this twofold sort of sound. I think if we simplify music ridiculously way down into sort of the three-legged stool. If you got melody, you've got harmony, you've got rhythm. With the bells, you get rhythm. And with the chant melodies and things, you get melody and this particular melodic structure. And he was so enthralled by this and captivated by it that he actually continued to go to church, and actually especially to monasteries. When he came to Moscow, when he switched to study at the Moscow Conservatory, he was known to get up early in the morning and find a way to get to one of the local monasteries that actually sang the Znameni chant, which most large parish churches didn't really do the chant tradition anymore at that time. But he would go and just stand for hours and listen to the music. And this really just sort of entered his, I guess you could say, his musical soul. and came out in the way that he wrote his music from there. In terms of rhythm, the Russian bell ringing does have a very peculiar sort of polyphony of rhythm with all these layers on top of each other. You've also got a kind of a cycle of small rhythmic patterns that repeat over and over. And this comes out in all of these places in Rachmaninoff's music. You know, the third movement from the second and the third piano concertos has that sort of characteristic cycling rhythm sound, for instance. And we who came to Rachmaninoff's music just as sort of from the classical side, from the classical music world, we don't actually notice these patterns because it's just, to us, it's just his language. It's what he wrote. And then once sort of later in life, for me anyway, later in life when I discovered this tradition of Russian Orthodox music and the bell ringing, I thought, oh my goodness, this is exactly where all of these ideas came from. And I think as we go through his works, we can see that pattern of spiritual influence grows over the course of his life. You know, even though he didn't come from a devout family, that seed that was planted to him at a young age really did come out and flower in a lot of these great works later in his life.
So it's interesting that you say about the rhythmic influence of it, because when I think of bell ringing as an influence on music, of course I think of Messiaen. And for Messiaen, it's more of the harmonics, you know, that he uses the overtone series in a certain way that reflects the overtones that you get in a really large piece of metal vibrating as a sort of aural halo, kind of like an analog to halos that you see in visual art. But it's not, it does play a rhythmic role, but it also plays that harmonic role in Messiaen. But do you think that there's a harmonic influence in the sound of bells in Rachmaninoff's harmony?
You know, I think maybe to some degree. I think the rhythmic thing is certainly the primary influence, but there's a point, there are one or two places I'm thinking of, like in the last movement of the first two piano suite is sort of a, it's a picture, if you will. It's a musical picture of bell ringing surrounding the Russian Orthodox Easter hymn, the Paschal hymn. And there are a couple of points where there's these very low chords that are actually quite dissonant in terms of Western, you know, language. But it's clear that that's kind of what he heard, and what he was trying to recreate was the sound of this really low bell and some of the overtones that came from it. I think other than that, it was probably mainly rhythm in terms of at least his harmonic language, I guess I could say, is still fairly conventional by the terms, by the, you know, the conventions of late Romantic classical music.
So let's listen to a little bit of an example of Orthodox bell ringing, and then we'll listen to a little bit of it appearing, as mentioned, in Rachmaninoff's music. And now let's listen to a little bit of this in Rachmaninoff. So this is the opening of the first piano suite for two pianos, but the fourth movement. So what do you think it meant for him spiritually? Was it kind of like a nostalgia, or was it something that the bell meant something as a sort of icon or symbol of something in his music?
It's hard to say for sure, what he personally thought. He was notoriously, sort of closed about discussing spiritual matters or anything personal in his life. But I think that it's obvious from, his relationships with other people, what they have written, what they have said, and the role that that sound sort of plays in his music and in his life, that part of it is a nostalgia, but I think that's more of a superficial thing. There's an incredible depth to what the bells mean, I guess, if you want to think of it that way, in the especially the Russian tradition. It's like the ground itself is ringing, is celebrating, is worshiping. It's like the entire, the city or the area, the entire country, in a sense, is rejoicing or mourning or praying with the bells. And it is very real, what that sort of sense is. It's a very, very powerful thread in the Russian culture. And you can sort of see it if you go back and sort of study what happened when the Soviets took over. They took the bells out of the churches, destroyed them, melted them down for scrap, whatever it was, because they knew that this was sort of this very tangible physical symbol of the faith of the land, the faith of this people. And that was why they had to, try anyway to destroy it. And after the fall of communism, incredible celebrations took place when people were able to bring back the bells and put them in the churches again. And there are these big processions and great services and all of these. It's incredibly central to the experience of the Russian Orthodox people.
So a little bit more particular, could you talk a little bit more about Rachmaninoff's faith? Did he have periods of devotion and periods of falling away? You mentioned his life as a child already, but was he a particularly Orthodox Christian?
I think that he grew to be more devout over the course of his life. I think, as I said earlier, he didn't really start out in that place, but having enough of a grounding in the experience of the church, even though he wasn't catechized at home, he really wasn't taught much about the faith, but having that experience made sure that the church never left him. And after he had to leave the country and, ended up in America and made his life here, I think that also having gone through all of the suffering that he had to go through and seeing the suffering of his country and of his people and all of this made him kind of search for that meaning and kind of is there a redemption to this? And it, also because he had studied the liturgy and the life of the church enough to write for the church, even before he left Russia, and really took a lot of time to understand, okay, why is this here? What is this hymn? Why is this in this place? He clearly cared quite a lot about it. And then by the time we get to the end of his life, he actually died in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles. And he was very, very intent that, okay, I'm going to be buried in the church. I want the funeral to be as the church prescribes. He went and made his final confession. He received Holy Communion, all of the things that a pious Orthodox Christian would hope to be able to do before they pass away. And partly because, we don't have a journal from him, for instance. He wasn't a person to talk a lot about his internal feelings. It's speculation in a sense, and you don't find a lot of it in sort of the musicological body about Rachmaninoff, I think, especially because so much of that is sort of written from a more secular perspective. But I really think that he developed this profound awareness of human suffering and the hope of resurrection in Christ, specifically according to the Orthodox faith, especially by the time he got towards the end of his life.
So another sort of personal and rather relatable fact about Rachmaninoff, especially having just emerged from 2020, it's just the beginning of 2021 as we record this, is Rachmaninoff's struggle with depression and nerves. This seems like something that perhaps a lot of our listeners can relate to, and something that's really important to understand in the lives of artists, or even for our listeners in the professional relationship between priests and music directors. So, what were some of the particular struggles for Rachmaninoff in this regard, and how did he manage to emerge from them?
I think that it's pretty well known from if people even sort of superficially have examined Rachmaninoff's life that he had kind of this lifelong battle with depression, actually, even in his younger years, in his student years. And after that, as he was sort of establishing himself as a rising star in Russian music. Most famously, he wrote his first symphony. It was premiered. Alexander Glazunov was the conductor, and it went terribly. It was a disaster, not well rehearsed. The critics didn't like it. The audience didn't like it, and it just shattered Rachmaninoff. He had no confidence at all, and actually couldn't even write any large works, at least, for several years, 4 or 5 years, if I remember right. And oddly enough, his family, they were trying to figure out, okay, how can we rebuild your confidence here? We need to help you come back to this place, because this is clearly your gifting. You need to be writing music. And he went to this doctor named Nikolai Dahl, who was a specialist in hypnotherapy, of all things. And he was able to kind of calm Rachmaninoff down, and through a series of sessions over about 3 months, rebuilt his confidence. And after that point, he wrote, 3 of his greatest works. You have the second 2-piano suite, the second piano concerto, the cello sonata. But even after that, it kind of went in cycles in a sense. You had some periods that were very good and fruitful in his life, and other periods that really were not. He was also sort of haunted by death and sort of either fears or not necessarily premonitions, but he was very cautious about things that could have anything to do with death, and became kind of fixated musically. This came out in his use of the Dies Irae, the ancient chant, because he would either use it as a motto straight out, or he would actually kind of turn it into a passage and embed it into some of the passage work that he would use. And this is in small pieces, big pieces, the Paganini Rhapsody, it's all over the place. And I think that one of the lessons that we can take out of that, at least for our time, is that even these people that we think of as, being very successful people and very talented and very gifted people, absolutely have these periods of time where they may be really unproductive, and sort of go into this rut. And we, have to continue to bear with them, help them, pray with them, make sure that they know that they're still supported. It's funny, there's an old saying in the Orthodox Church that, a saint is not a man who never falls. A saint is the one who every time he falls, he gets up and continues and repents and keeps going. And no matter how many times he falls, he continues to struggle on that path toward God. And I think that you can see that, to some extent in Rachmaninoff's life and in his biography.
So, what are some of the other spiritual themes that come to the fore in Rachmaninoff's music, and what do you think is notable about his artistic voice in expressing these themes?
I think that a lot of his music can be experienced as a sort of a paradox. It seems like it's dark, very much in turmoil. A lot of it is in minor keys, and there's a lot of just this movement running around different places. But then, when you experience the entire work as a whole, it often turns out that there's this beautiful sort of deep brightness to it. This is something that you get a sense of deep, resonant joy, almost like coming out of the earth, that's so overpowering. I'm thinking of, there's these moments of, like the second symphony in the slow movement there. There's the incredible, the climaxes of the piano concertos and different things where all of this seeming struggle is sort of resolved at the end. And I think that this, in a way, speaks to a little bit of his biography that we were just discussing. But also, I think that it speaks to a little bit of the Russian experience of the time that, people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, Pushkin, all of these people were also discussing in the literary realm. There's all of this struggle and pain and uncertainty just around them at this time. And it even continues, into when you think of the works of Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and all of this. The story of Russia is sort of subsumed into suffering in a lot of these different ways. But despite that, there is this joy that remains sort of like deep underneath it in a lot of these places. And I think that one of the best examples of this in Rachmaninoff's music is a quote that he makes in the Symphonic Dances, which is his last major work that he wrote. It's an orchestral work. It also exists in a 2-piano version that he created. And at the very end of that piece, the end of the third movement, and I really think he did know this was the last major work he was going to write. So this is kind of his Beethoven Opus 111 in a sense. It's his statement about sort of the problem of man and our experience. And what he does is he takes a quote from an ancient Znameni chant that he uses in the 9th movement of his all-night vigil. And it comes from the point in Matins where there's a set of hymns called, in Greek anyway, the Eulogitaria, which it recounts the story of the myrrh-bearing women coming to the tomb. They're surprised by the angel. They inform them that Christ is, in fact, risen. And so the way that this hymn works and what he sets is you have this continuing refrain from Psalm 119 or 118 in the Septuagint numbering, which is, "Blessed art thou, O Lord, teach me thy statutes." And set against that is a text that this chant is setting, which is, "The company of the angels was amazed when they beheld thee numbered among the dead. Yet thyself, O Savior, destroying the power of death, with thee raising up Adam and releasing all men from hell." And that is the melody that Rachmaninoff uses at the very end of his Symphonic Dances to sort of resolve this problem. And I think the thing that relates this to the Dies Irae is earlier in that third movement, there is all of this struggle back and forth with the Dies Irae motive. Sometimes it's very, obviously stated. Sometimes it's very much in the texture, but it sort of represents this ever presence of death in humanity. And goodness, we've had that hanging over us, as you mentioned, we're just coming out of 2020 and this specter of death everywhere. And as I mentioned earlier, Rachmaninoff was haunted by this, but the way that he uses this at the close of the piece, I think that this is his statement of, as the angel says to the women, "Why are you afraid? Christ has conquered death." And the chant melody goes into the Alleluia, and the Alleluia ends in this glorious sort of D major finale at the end of the Symphonic Dances. And that's sort of his apotheosis in a sense. And it's really very moving and very profound.
So let's listen to this ending of the third movement of the 2-piano version of Rachmaninoff's Symphonic Dances. So if people know any piece from Rachmaninoff, it might be one of his piano concerti, especially if they saw the 1996 movie Shine, or perhaps more specifically his Bogorodice Dievo from his all-night vigil, sometimes referred to as just the Vespers. Could you situate this latter composition for us in the structure and calendar of the Eastern Liturgy? And is the all-night vigil usable in a liturgical context, or is it something that needs adaptation for use in that setting?
Absolutely. The vigil, as we call it, or the all-night vigil, is absolutely a regular service for us in the Eastern liturgy. It is normally Vespers and Matins, and then the first hour, the beginning of the Divine Office. And what makes it all night, that might be sort of a misnomer. I mean, even if you took all of the pieces of it and everybody sang very slowly, the priest and the deacon and the choir all took their time, you could probably get done in about 5 hours or so. So the all night part is, maybe not literally true.
Just a little exaggerated.
Although I suppose that, after the after that, then you would normally do the liturgy, which is another 2 hours or so. So maybe in that case, you start getting into the all-night setting. And in fact, in parish life today, if you go to even, in the Greek church, my local parish here is in the Greek tradition, and we are quite frequently do a vigil, especially on a major feast day. Whether, Theophany, Transfiguration, of course, Pâques. There's a lot of places where what we would do sort of in modern parish usage is we just put Vespers and Matins together, and then you chant those, and it's about 3 hours. And so we usually do that the night before and then do the liturgy in the morning. Normally in our parishes, I know at least in the Orthodox usage, we don't have daily liturgies. There's not really like a daily communion tradition in the Orthodox world anyway. And so most parishioners, if they go to church every day, they're going to have a Vespers at night. They might have a Matins in the morning, or maybe they'll do a couple of the hours, so that it's kind of situated within that particular context. And what Rachmaninoff did is really quite fascinating. He wrote earlier in his life, he did set the liturgy, which is, of course, the Eastern Mass, if you will. And he essentially did everything with the liturgy. He wrote all the responses that the choir sings. There are several series of petitions where the deacon or the priest, intones a petition, the choir responds, Lord have mercy. Goes back. He set all of those. He set all the amens. He set all of the little tiny hymns here and there that happen. So it's really sort of pre-made for the choir director to say, yes, I could use that in a service, assuming you have a choir that could sing Rachmaninoff for 2 hours, which is its own difficulty. In the Vigil, he actually decided not to set everything. He set specific hymns here and there. Most of them are fairly traditional ones that you would set. And a couple of them are some that are, they're either tacked on at the end of Matins, or there's some that are sort of optional that he chose to set as well. So it's an interesting challenge if you think of it from a liturgical context, because it's not necessarily like, oh, let's just use Rachmaninoff's setting of the Vigil. If you did, you'd still have to find settings of all the litanies. You'd have to have settings of some of the other things like the Kathisma hymns that come after the psalm readings, and some other things that just he didn't really set, and then it would be sort of musically weird because you'd have all of this music that's Rachmaninoff, and then you'd have other fairly pedestrian music to set some of the other things, and that would be kind of strange. But I think that, even despite that, a lot of the highlights of the service are absolutely there. A lot, obviously the Orthodox people would recognize a lot of the texts, but also, people who are familiar with any of the ancient liturgical texts, the Nunc Dimittis is in there. You have the Bogorodica, as you mentioned. You've got the Magnificat. You also have the Fore, the Great Doxology, which is at the end of Matins, which is, very ancient, 4th century previous to that even. And eventually that became what's now the Gloria and the Te Deum and some other things in the Western liturgy. So there are all of these very, well-known texts in there that he sets. But if you did the whole thing time-wise, just the pieces of music, it's still about, I think, 1 hour and 40 minutes. So it is, a pretty severe undertaking, even without trying to fit it into a liturgical context.
Right. So could you set up for us this particular recording that we're going to hear from the all-night vigil?
Yes, this was actually a neat project that we were able to do several years ago. I always, as a pianist, you're sort of required to like Rachmaninoff, it's there. But I had discovered his choral music kind of later on after I came into the Orthodox Church, and had always wanted to find an excuse to bring some people together and do something of it. Our parish here is very small. We don't really have a lot of singers, so it wasn't something we could do in a liturgical setting. But what I decided to do was bring together some of our students, some of our community members, and bring our priest up as well, and actually do, a couple of the movements as best we could from the liturgy. So what we decided to do is open with the Great Litany, which is the very opening of the liturgy. The priest sort of gives the intoning of the opening of the service, and then the choir responds Amen. And then there are all of these prayers back and forth where the priest offers prayers for literally everything in the world. So it goes on for a while. And then the choir responds. It was a really wonderful experience for us spiritually. It was really neat for me to be able to bring in some of my Orthodox faith into, the university where I teach, where a lot of the students here especially don't even know what the Orthodox Church is, or that there is an Eastern Church. So that was a very special moment for us.
So let's listen to the litany.
Отца и Сына и Святого Духа, ныне и присно, и во веки веков. Миром Господу помолимся. Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. Мире всего мира, благостояние святых Божьих, церквей соединены всех, Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. О святем храме сем и с верою, благоговением и страхом Божиим входящих вон, Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. О всех благочестивых и православных христиан, Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. Патриарсих православных, о преосвященнейшем епископе нашем, честнем пресвитерстве, во Христе диаконстве, о всем причте людях, Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. Стране нашей и о всякой христианской стране, Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. О придержащих властях наших и о всем воинстве, Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. О граде всем, всяком граде стране, верою живущих в них, Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. Воздухов, о изобилии плодов земных и временных мирных, Господу помолимся. Господи, помилуй. О плавающих, путешествующих, недугующих, страждущих, пленениях и о спасении их, Господу помолимся. Господу помолимся. Заступи, спаси, помилуй, сохрани нас, Боже, Твоею благодатью. Господи, Пресвятую, пречистую, преблагословенную, славную Владычицу нашу, Богородицу и пресную Деву Марию, со всеми святыми помянувши сами себе и друг друга, и весь живот наш Христу Богу предадим.
Having yourself spent a lot of time now in the world of Russian church music, could you share with us some insights about Rachmaninoff's use of chant tones in his music? What are some of the tones that you can trace, and how does he use them in his liturgical music? Are they transformed or quoted in his concert music? You mentioned their melodic use earlier. Generally speaking, is it that they're quoted in his liturgical compositions and then sort of transformed in his concert pieces? Or are they in any way translated into a more Western sound in either of those repertories?
It's a very interesting question to answer, actually, because he did absolutely use extant chant melodies. One of his professors at the Moscow Conservatory was kind of famous for reviving the ancient chant tradition and training a lot of composers who wrote for the church, right up until the church was outlawed. And even though not all of Rachmaninoff's melodies, even in his liturgical compositions, are literally chant melodies, they are all chant-like melodies. And even people that are, steeped in the tradition and know a lot of the Znameny melodies, they'll still hear Rachmaninoff at certain points and think, oh, that has to be a chant melody. And they'll go and try to find it. And it's not. It's just a melody he wrote. It's an original melody that is just so like what came from the Znameny tradition that it's like indistinguishable. And Rachmaninoff sort of joked about that. He said, I write very good counterfeit chant melodies. And he would work them in different places. And, essentially you've got, I think this is fairly universal in the ancient church, the Western, Eastern church. All of us have this tradition of having 8 tones that they manifest themselves in different ways in different areas. And, in the Eastern church, anyway, you sort of rotate them each week. So you have tone 1 week, you have a tone 2 week, and so forth and so on. And all of the services sort of have these hymns that are peculiar to each tone that serve as sort of the ordinaries of every week. And so you'd kind of experience different musical, poetic content each week. And what Rachmaninoff was able to do is kind of, it's not so much that he harmonized them as he kind of made them the core layer of several layers. And yes, of course, he put harmonies around it that we would recognize as Western listeners. And it still makes sense in the harmonic tradition of the West. I mean, you can analyze it, for instance, in sort of a Roman numeral sense, although it's not as cut and dried as, even Tchaikovsky is to some degree. But he never lost sense that the melody was the primary point. Even when he did have a full harmonization of something, say in 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 parts in these choral works, the bass part is, you think of, especially when I was growing up sort of in the evangelical world, and we still if we would pull out the hymn book, say, and sang hymns, the bass part jumps all over the place. It has to set the foundation of the chordal progression in different ways. And you could have a jump of a sixth or a seventh or some very awkward leaps. But with Rachmaninoff's bass parts, I mean, it's not that there aren't ever leaps, because there are, but the contour of it is still very much more in that stepwise, or maybe you have a leap of a fourth, and that's a really big leap. And he builds upon all of these layers to make this sort of in and out sense that is extremely polyphonic, very difficult to kind of pull apart in some ways. But at the same time, it's still familiar to Western listeners, sort of in that late Romantic tradition. So it's a really remarkable achievement.
So to wrap up a little bit, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how Rachmaninoff, and perhaps why he ended up in the US, and what his relationship with the Soviet Union was like in this latter part of his life.
In a sense, it's kind of an obvious answer. I mean, you think of so many people who had to leave Russia in 1917, but it's actually kind of a roundabout way that he ended up here, because even before that turmoil, there was a period of unrest about 1905 or so, and he actually moved his family to Dresden in Germany for about 3 years, starting in 1906, and then just spent summers back home in Russia. And while he was out there, he did tour the U.S. for the first time. He came to 1909. He had just written the third piano concerto. Famously, he had to practice on a silent keyboard on the ship on his way over, because there was no other way for him to practice. And one of the coolest moments in music history must have been the second performance of that concerto was with the New York Philharmonic, conducted by Gustav Mahler.
Wow.
And I was thinking to myself, oh, that there would have been recording technology to capture that. That must have been incredible. But in any case, he did actually move back to Russia for a while, about 1910, and he stayed right up until 1917, until it was pretty clear that he was no longer welcome there as an upper class kind of aristocratic person. In fact, the revolutionaries kind of seized the house where he lived and declared it the communal property of the revolution. And he says, well, I guess I have to leave now. And ended up he had arranged a Scandinavian tour. So he ended up in Copenhagen. And then he received several offers actually to come to the U.S. and work as a conductor. The Boston Symphony tried to get him twice. The Cincinnati Symphony wanted him to come and be their conductor. But he had eventually decided that the best way for him to financially support himself and his family was to be a touring pianist. And so he lived in New York and toured around the country during the season, and then spent his summers sort of resting in different places, pretty much from about 1918, 1919, all onward until right before his death. He moved to Beverly Hills I think it was in 1942, and he had already been diagnosed with an advanced melanoma at that point, and then he died just the year after that, 1943. So it's kind of hard to say. You ask about his relationship with the Soviet Union, and in a sense, it wasn't even the same country, but it was the same land, and it was the same people, and he still had many extended family members, students, friends there. He kept up with them. We know from some correspondence, he would send them gifts or send them some money if they needed it, or other things, but he certainly was not sympathetic to the new government. And in fact, he, along with a few other Russian immigrants, he published a letter to the editor of all things in the New York Times in 1931, criticizing the way the Soviet government was going about their cultural projects, and that got his music briefly banned in the USSR for a couple of years. I think mostly he was just profoundly sad and devastated by the total loss of history and culture, spiritual identity that was perpetrated by the Bolsheviks, by the communists. And again, we don't have his own thoughts on these things. This comes from, people in his family speaking about it, or things that we can sort of glean from it. But I think it's a very, a natural thing to be able to assume in the way that he went about his life after he left. He did try once to go back home. He was starting to get some paperwork together, but it didn't work out for a number of different reasons. And in fact, even when he died, he did express a wish to be buried in Moscow. But that was, of course, in the middle of World War II. Then you had the Cold War. There are all of these difficulties. And so he he is still now buried in Valhalla, New York, outside the city, in a place that I can only assume was supposed to be sort of a temporary spot, but it's become his resting place along with his family. And his family to this day has no intention of sending him back to Russia. They think this is where he should be. The local Orthodox community takes very good care of him, sort of his grave there. In fact, they came and they did this big memorial service on the 75th anniversary of his death in 2018. I think that would have been, sang the traditional Orthodox memorial service. And it's a very, very interesting life, and yeah, very sad in a lot of ways. But I think that it's also very inspiring to see somebody that really wrestled with his faith, having to go through so much of this suffering that was such an incredible upheaval at the time, both for him personally and for his people, his country, his folk, and seeing how through that came such works of incredible beauty and great truth, both when you think of the things that were explicitly written for the church and those things that were, ostensibly written as secular pieces, but really have a profound spiritual message.
Yeah, it's that bright sadness, as the Orthodox love to speak about. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, Richard. And we're really grateful, too, for your recordings. And I always love hearing you play. Where can people find out more about your work?
Well, you can go to my website, which is www.richardfountainpianist.com. It's all one word. And I think you can find out pretty much everything you need to find out about me there. There are a lot of odds and ends to my life. I think they're kind of interesting. It's been a really neat life to this point. I hope the Lord gives me many more years and that I can continue this, living in music. I have to say, especially, in this time going through 2020 and everything, it is such an incredible blessing to be able to come into my studio here at my school and just incarnate beauty, if you will. You can bring beauty into existence through sound, through music, and that great gift that God has given us. And I don't know if I could have survived if I, worked at a desk somewhere and didn't have music to be a part of, both, in my, my day-to-day work as a pianist and a teacher, and also in my work as a church musician and a chanter. It's so incredibly fulfilling.
Thank you so much for this. And we look forward to having you back on again.
Thanks so much. This has been a wonderful conversation.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.